So we're back to Don Ewell.
The Don Ewell record that we did in Washington, also in the same place where we did the Zudi Singleton thing, on the stage of the Manassas High School, Osborne High School. Was a good place to record. The acoustics were really very good, and they had a Steinway D that was in really good shape. They must have had a benefactor of some sort, because I can't imagine a small school district having a $1 zillion piano like that. But that was one of the craziest recording things that I ever got involved in because, as I said, I was down staying at Squirrel Ashcraft's house. I had brought a Condon band to play at the inauguration.
Do you remember who was in the band?
Yeah, Wild Bill, Johnny Mintz, Eddie, who was the drummer? Who did he bring? I remember Johnny Mintz because Johnny got in trouble because this is Johnny Mintz, and it says the Secret Service guy said it says Minzenberger in your passport, and he says anyway I'm just wondering who was. I remember that certainly Bill. Who would have been the clarinet? I'd have to go back and look. I don't really remember. But what I do remember is that the day that we got there, Squirrel was in Spain, but he gave us the house. And Eddie and Phyllis were there. Marilyn Danitz and I were there. And we had come directly from New York. Eddie had done a concert the night before up in Connecticut someplace, and it was Eddie with Krupa. It was a good one. And I was just exhausted. I'd done all the driving back and forth to Connecticut, all the way down to Washington and so forth. Eddie, however, was ready to roll. And it was that night, the night that we arrived, which was a Saturday, was the night of a ball that Spiro Agnew was throwing at a convention center or an armory or something like that, over by the old DC Stadium where the baseball players played and the Redskins played and stuff. And I did not want to go. Eddie wanted to go, and I said, Eddie, I don't like Spiro Agnew. I think he's a crook, and have no interest in doing that. Eddie said, well, I'm going to go, and he put on all of his fancy clothes, and he left. And about 2 minutes later, he came back upstairs and says, I think there aren't any cabs out in the street. Well, Squirrel did in the neighborhood, and they don't have any cabs that prowl the streets in Washington anyway. Would you please take me? So I took him. Now, I'm dressed really badly, just how I dressed driving down to Washington. And so he says, show me where to go. So we parked, and I took him to the back of, to the armory. And I said, we're supposed to go in here. And the guy at the gate says, no, you got to go around back. So I went around back, and they had an entrance. And I remember going in, and Eddie's all dressed up nicely. Some nice little pinstripe suit and his bow tie and his hat and everything. And the guy, the Secret Service guy on the gate, says, do you have any identification? And Eddie, who never had anything like that, he usually had, 5 $1 bills, and that was that. He says, yeah. He took off his hat, and here's his name, Eddie Condon, inside the hat. And the Secret Service guy just couldn't believe that. And so I'm there looking grubby. I have not probably shaved for the day. I have an old dirty car coat on. I'm not dressed nicely. And I said, excuse me, sir. And I reach in my pocket, and I have my CIA badge. And I said, opened it up, and I showed it to him. I says, this is me. I says, this is Mr. Condon. Says, we're both on the guest list, but I don't want to go in. And just about that minute, and I don't remember to this day whether it was Hackett came by or Tony Bennett came by, one or the other, and said, "Hey Eddie, get on in here. Hey, how are you? Blah blah blah." And I said, "Bye," and I went back home and went to bed, because I had to mind Don Ewell for a recording session the next day. Early the next morning, the phone rings, and it is Eddie, and his first words to me are, "Where am I?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And anyway, to make a very long story short, I said, "Eddie, wherever you are, is there a phone number on the phone where you're calling from?" And he says, "Yeah." I said, "What is it?" He told me. I wrote it down. He says, "Hang up." So I called back, and he was at a Holiday Inn over in Virginia someplace. So I says, "Eddie, I'll come and get you. Stay put." And he said, "Okay, but bring some wash." And I said, "Okay." So I got a bottle of 7-Up, and I emptied out the 7-Up, and I filled it up with vodka. And I put one of those rubber stoppers in it, put it in my coat pocket, went to the floor where Eddie was supposed to be, and he was supposed to be in room 502 or something. He wasn't. Bobby Hackett was, passed out. And so I go out and find the chambermaid. Chambermaid, I said, have you seen a well-dressed gentleman, older gentleman, running up and down? He says, "Oh yeah, he's over there." So I went over, and he was in the process of, Eddie was in the process of taking all of Tony Bennett's liquor, because Tony was on the same floor, and Tony doesn't drink. Eddie's standing there like this. Anyway, that's how I met Tony Bennett. Eddie was stealing all of his stuff. So I said, "Eddie, we got to go downstairs. I've got to go find Don Ewell. We've got to go make a record." He says, "Oh, good, let's go." So went downstairs, got in the car, went out, and found Don was staying someplace in Northern Virginia, picked him up, and by that time, Eddie was in the back seat with a bottle of scotch, strangely enough, scotch, not vodka, and he was enjoying it, and he had a swig out of it, and we're driving down the road, and Don says, "Listen, I have to make a record. Give me a shot of that." So Eddie passes him up the bottle, and Don does this, and he says, "Well, and he hands it back to Eddie, and he looks over in my car coat, and he sees the 7-Up bottle, and he grabs the 7-Up bottle out of my coat, and before I can do anything, he takes the thing and he guggles that down, and it's vodka. So we get to the high school, we go in the back, and the very first thing, Don walks to the lip of the stage and vomits, and then sits down and is flawless for an hour. And that record also got 5 stars in Downbeat. And the thing that's sort of fun about it, I had traded some tapes with George Buck, and even though that record was for Fat Cat McCree, George Buck traded me those tapes back, so I was able to put together a CD that had all 3 of the Don Ewell LPs that I had made on 2 CDs, and all 3 of them were 5-star Downbeat records. And it would have been fun for Don to have seen them, but he had checked out a long time before. So, but anyway, back to Chiaroscuro. When I made the recording of Don Ewell, Marion got annoyed with me. She says, "Hank, you're recording all these old-timey people, and the main thing that I want to do is I need to make another record." And I said, "Well, we just put one out." And I said, "Well, I want to." Anyway, she thought that I was going a little far afield and taking too much stuff under, on my own. And she was right. I mean, I just liked everybody. I wanted to make it. And we had recorded Willie the Lion Smith, which was the biggest disaster in the world because Willie was nervous. He couldn't record at Sherman's. Sherman would come in and be nice to him and all, and they had known each other since the 20s, and Willie just couldn't do it, and I didn't know how we were going to finish the Willie the Lion record. Finally hit on the idea of taking him. He was going to play a week or two at Blues Alley in Washington, so I went to Washington with him and recorded him live, and he was quite spectacular. He didn't even know I was doing it, and it was, but that record had technical complications, which Sherman Fairchild solved. It was the only record I ever did that something that you couldn't hear but happened electronically. It was acoustically out of phase, which meant you couldn't cut a master lacquer. You could cut a master lacquer that was sort of like a Hill and Dale Edison record, but you couldn't take a stereo thing. But it turned out that in the early 50s, when Sherman Fairchild was a little more active in the electronic parts of Fairchild Recording Products, he and Bob Fine, a name that is, Bob was one of the finest engineers there was. He was the guy who figured out the 18-minute missing Nixon stuff. Anyway, they had built a machine that was called a compatibilizer that we ran the Willie tapes through and were able to cut a lacquer. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been that record. But what happened was that Marion was increasingly upset that we had all these old-timey guys like Bobby Henderson or Willie the Lion and only one of hers. And so what happened was we split up the company. She retained the masters that she had done for her two solo records, Interplay and Ambience, and Sherman and I kept Willie the Lion, Earl Hines, and Bobby Henderson, and we went our separate ways. Marion was always mad that she thought that I had sandbagged her with Sherman and things like that. Wasn't the case. Sherman was having fun anymore, and he's the one who did the splitting. I didn't, because the truth of the matter was we had each put in $500 into the pot, but Sherman had paid for everything else. I mean, if there was, the pressing things and the pressing cost and the album cost and the jackets and everything was being paid by Sherman. I should interject, the basis, when I knew Sherman in the late 60s and early 70s, he was the head of Fairchild Recording Products, which I think made about 10 cents a year. But he was also the head of Fairchild Hiller, the aviation company, and Fairchild Semiconductor, and Fairchild Aerial Surveys. And I mean, the reason that I saw him in the first place was because he was making the cameras that we were putting in satellites in U-2s. That's what he did. And it was all based on him selling a little bit of the stock that he had from 1919 when his father died. His father had founded the company that became IBM. And at the time of Sherman's death, he was the largest single stockholder in IBM still, even though it was many years later. And so, I mean, it was basically his ball game with his bat and his ball and so forth. So Chiaroscuro split off from Halcyon, and we went on from there. That's the good news. The bad news was that in 1972, we were working on a project. Sherman loved Oscar Peterson, just loved Oscar Peterson. And Oscar was done with MPS, and Norman hadn't started Pablo yet. So Sherman decided he wanted to record Oscar Peterson, which he could certainly have afforded to do had he wanted to. And we had a date to go see OP he was playing at that club that was in the basement of the Plaza Hotel. I forget what it was called. But anyway, I went over to Sherman's house 2 days before that, and I talked to his secretary, and I said, we all set to go see Oscar. And she said, well, don't you know? And I said, don't I know what? And it says, well, Sherman went in for a minor procedure at the hospital on Friday, and they found a polyp on his intestine, and they operated, and he's still in the hospital, and he's not coming out of it very well, so we had to postpone it. Anyway, to make a very long story a little bit shorter, Sherman lingered at the hospital for about 6 weeks and finally died. Not of the operation or anything like that, but he was killed, literally killed in the hospital by, they had given him a impure batch of IV glucose, and he was poisoned. Anyway, Sherman died, and Chiaroscuro became a tiny carbuncle on the butt of $1 billion estate.
That is a good place to pause.